hearing back from you is most valuable is hearing from peers as to what they're actually doing. So we're going to get some stories from the front line, some real life examples of how you know, early career experts are navigating these challenging times and trying to continue to provide the best support for their graduates. So thanks again so much to Joe and Gemma. Looking forward to hearing from you both. Then we're going to look a little bit about onboarding best practice, and that really is looking at the science about, you know, what does best practice onboarding look like? And we're doing that without a virtual lens in the first instance, because one of the things that research shows to date is that it is important to still understand what the best practice principles are. And then we'll move on to think about, okay, well, given that, how do we still provide rich, meaningful experience for our graduates in a virtual context? So we'll consider some strategies for that. And then Koecher is actually going to speak to some tangible examples of how some employers and some of our partners are going about doing that, over in addition to the stories we'll have heard from Joe and Gemma. And then we'll just have a few kind of top tips to end on, and as I said, plenty of time for chat at the end. Anything you want to add there, Koecher?
Nope.
I'll just keep checking in with Keisha. As she said, she's manning the chat function. So if you do have any questions at any point, please do pop them in and we will address them as we go through. So the first thing is the COVID context. And actually, just before we look at some data, we wanted to have an interactive part. So if you've been here before, Keisha's about to launch a poll, and there will be some options, and we're just basically asking you what's the current status of your induction or onboarding program, and that's just to get a sense from those of you on the webinar this morning. How are you altering it, or are you not? You know, are you putting it on hold? Are you delaying it? It's funny, I'm even just looking at the answers now. I think we no longer have one that says still planning to run it in person, because we now know that that's not possible. But I think the first time we had a virtual masterclass, that was still, you know, we had a lot of clients who were hoping that we could still do it face to face, and obviously now we know that that's not likely. But hooray for shops opening and support bubbles. I was excited about that. Might get to see my mum.
I'm going to give everyone, we've just got a few people who haven't voted, and give them one more second, and then I will end the poll and share the results with you all. So there we go.
Very exciting.
Share results. Right, there you go.
Great. So we have a winner, which is interesting, because sometimes in these it's fairly evenly split. So which is what it feels like from our perspective, which is most organisations are aiming to still do their program and to run it virtually. So that's 71% of you are planning to still. So well done. It's not easy. And then some the next highest, so 13% delaying and being run virtually, with 2% on hold, and respectively 1% on delaying and hoping to run it in person and other. So that's where we are. We did take a poll. We sent a survey out in advance of this, and similar in that running to normal timing, but virtually was still the most popular response, but perhaps slightly more evenly spread between delaying and hoping to run in person and delaying it virtually. So that's very interesting. I mean, I think there's lots of interesting things happening out there from universities like Cambridge, and I know lots of others to follow, already sort of stating that they're going to spend next year in delivering lectures virtually, through to sort of some organisations just recognising that they want to move much more to virtual platforms. A lot of the responses are actually kind of going beyond what the current context is enforcing, and thinking about future proofing a bit more if, you know, this goes on longer. So kind of more certainty perhaps around what we're doing with our graduates than in terms of whether it's virtual or than we've seen in the past. Quite a lot of uncertainty for those who are delaying as to when they might delay. So this is from the ISE's research. and shows that there's a whole host of decisions around whether people are going to delay. So this is among the employers that are members of the ISE, almost completely even between planning to delay, planning to stick to normal, and not being sure. So less certainty perhaps among the ISE employers than those on the call this morning. And then within that uncertainty, as you can see, there's quite a lot of uncertainty about when to delay to. So from September being the size of the letter of the word indicates popularity, so September still being the main choice, but then beyond that, kind of a mix between October, January, all the way out to as far as March. So still quite a bit of uncertainty as we're trying to navigate what's going on with and how to best handle our programs. Another piece of data from the ISE, which you may have seen, and this is their kind of most recent, so they did a survey of employers in March, and they've done a more recent one to get a more updated view. And what they found is that changes to hiring plans have affected graduates the least. So organisations, and it would be interesting, feel free to comment in the chat, interesting to know if this is reflected in your organisations. I know, for instance, Fidelity are still investing in interns and have virtualised their intern programme. But for a lot of organisations, if they are changing hiring plans, that's impacting non-graduate and intern hires rather than graduates. And so I think the point here to make is, broadly speaking, and especially as you can see for large firms, less so for SMEs, we are still bringing graduates into our business. So it is going to be critical to address how to onboard and induct them in a virtual context. So that's a little bit about the employer context, thinking about the impact of COVID. One of the things we had, Keisha and I had a conversation with lovely Bob Atwell from Salesforce the other day, and one of his observations was that we aren't hearing enough from the students. So I think some organisations are doing a good job of hearing the student voice, but perhaps we could do even more. So we wanted to look into some research that's out there on how students are actually feeling. And this comes from Trendance and can be found on the Next Step Support, which is a conglomerate of organisations who are looking at how specifically to support students in the face of this pandemic and the impact that that's had on employability. So I highly recommend looking there. It's got lots of resources if you haven't come across it already. That's Next Step Support. And from UK Trendance, who regularly run huge surveys across the student population and have been doing and do them monthly, and have obviously been looking at the impact of COVID, a couple of insights. The first of which is that uncertainty is increasing, or certainly was between March and April. And that's probably as we've become more aware that this, I think it's hard to imagine back to April when we might at any point have thought this was only going to last 3 weeks or 6, or that we could possibly be back in classrooms come September. But obviously nobody did know quite how deep and how long it was going to go, and now we're much clearer that it is going to go on in some context for some time, and much less certain about things like how we're going to get out of it, how successful the easing of measures is going to be, what's going to happen to the R, what's going to happen to the economy, so on and so forth. And obviously daily reports about everything from housing prices to economic impact, which are clearly worrying students who are also sort of probably navigating finishing their degrees in a virtual context and all sorts of things they didn't know they were going to have to. So they are feeling more and more uncertain. And obviously, I think that's just really important for us we know that, but for us to remember when we're thinking about how to support them. We'll talk about it more, but obviously the transition from education to the world of work is really challenging and reduces their level of certainty and confidence. And in the current context, that's going to be even more prescient. And then a second thing that was really interesting and this is a webinar which you can find on Next Step Support's website, all about the student reaction to COVID, was the fact that the skills that they are interested in acquiring are changing. The shape of the skills are changing, and they're changing in the direction that we might have imagined and expected they would. So I think a lot of the conversations we're having with people and organisations is around the importance of supporting things like adaptability and resilience, and indeed that's what students feel and recognise that they need and want support in. And I think, you know, we've talked about this. It's a very uncertain time. It's a very long time of uncertainty, and people cope with uncertainty and the need to be agile and adaptable differently. But pretty much everyone is going to have periods of, or a period of, or the frequent periods of feeling struggling. And I think the longer this goes on, the more people realise that they, you know, would benefit from support and top tips. So I think that's worth us remembering. I know it's front of mind for most employers when we think about graduates, and one of the interesting points that Dasha, who sort of head of research for Trendants, makes is that the gap between what the skills students want and employers want them to have is actually closing in a way. So employers have, for as long as I can remember the data showing, thought that resilience was a top skill that students need, and actually this situation has elevated their awareness that they need that. So there could be some positives coming out of this, in that there may be a more receptive audience there for obtaining some of these skills than was previously the case. So yeah, adaptability and resilience kind of the highest. Being organised again, which we talk about a lot, sort of how do we help people to self-manage in challenging times, and then perhaps some more practical skills around problem solving, creativity and communication. So I think I'm just trying to remind myself, Keisha, I think this is just an invitation, please, to start typing into the chat box, because it's an open question, so we couldn't do a poll. What we wanted to know, so that we could make sure that we address it in the rest of the session, is what are some of your biggest concerns about virtualising your onboarding or induction programme. So if you wouldn't mind just popping in the chat box anything that's been weighing on your mind, if you would, you know, give you know, your weight in gold for a magic solution to any particular problem, pop it in. Can't guarantee that we can give you a magic solution, but we'll certainly try and address it. And in that vein, we are now going to invite first Jo, because I know Jo needs to leave us in about half an hour, I think, to speak about what that she and the team are doing at Atkins to support graduates and to help onboard them. And then we'll hand over to Gemma. So Keisha, I'm sure, is currently unmuting Jo.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
yes, we can hear you.
Good morning, Jo. Hurrah.
I've just been having to try and log in on the iPhone as well as on the Skype, because Zoom wasn't working on my computer. So I'm very excited it's actually worked.
Well done.
Multitask.
Zoom hates me. I normally have to try and log in 3 different times. I think it's partly because my daughter's had Zoom lessons when she was at home, so it never knows who I am. Well done.
Cool.
Good morning. How are you, firstly, Jo? Are you well?
Yeah, I'm good. Thank you very much. And my little one is on day 4 of school, which is quite exciting.
Wow. Is she loving it?
I think so. She's excited because she's gone in her pink trainers because her school shoes no longer fit.
Yay, that is exciting. That's a great day. Oh, super. Fabulous. Well done, her. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us this morning, Jo.
No problem. So let me give you a little bit about who I am.
Yes, please.
So as you said, I'm the learning development consultant within our early careers team at Atkins. So we have approximately 750 graduates on a 3-year grad program and about 300 apprentices on our apprenticeship program, and they're studying everything from level 3s up to level 6s. So we have a sprinkling of under 18-year-olds with us, which presents, you know, I guess a few more challenges and perhaps taking on older apprentices, and we will be taking on a sprinkling of level 3s in this particular year's intake. So in terms of our picture for this year, we stopped our early careers recruitment about 2.5 months earlier than we normally would have done.
Right.
And we've reduced the numbers to our usual, so by probably quite some significant way. So we'll still have quite a significant graduate intake and a pretty small apprentice intake. I think the feeling was generally from the business that graduates would be able to be more adaptable, and they obviously need a bit less support than apprentices. The fear was with the apprentices, they really do need a lot of support, so that was going to be harder to make sure that we delivered that appropriately. Yeah. I think what's also really different this year is we always have spread out start dates, so that is something that we generally deal with. That doesn't affect our apprentices because they usually come in September time, because of course that links to their apprenticeship starting, which is generally around the September mark. But with the graduates, we've always had a few people who'll start a bit early because perhaps they've taken a year out and they want to get some money as soon as possible. But generally they would be starting between July and October, with the majority in August, September. And then we would catch them all with a face-to-face 2-day, generally around in Birmingham, big bang thing with about 400 of them at one event at a big end of September event. So that was our usual way of doing things. And then the apprentices, we get all of those together in a face-to-face 2-day in the October half term, which fitted with their studies. But this year, what we're looking at is about half the graduate intake is going to be delayed. Right. So we're awaiting numbers at the moment, but we're looking probably at some delay groups. So probably some will be in the delay by 3 months, some in the 3 to 6 month category, and there might be a very small number who'll be delayed up to 12 months. So this means thinking about it in quite a different way. Even if we could do everything face to face, we would still need to change some things, but clearly we won't be doing any face to face either. Yeah. So one of the things that we're really focusing on is really upping the ante on our Keep Warm program. So we already had quite a strong Keep Warm program because we start our recruitment early, and we needed to keep people because we'd be one of the first offers that they would be getting. So as part of that program, we have a buddy, continued contact from the recruitment advisor, who would be the same person all the way through that process, a Facebook group that they could join and post questions. And we used a particular platform called Koecher, where they can have access to mentors and some online e-learning type content, things like, what's it like to work here, some stuff on resilience. And so I think one of the things that we will be really working hard on is increasing our activity on that to keep those relationships live for those people who are going to be delayed. And I think for those people who will be delayed beyond in the 3 to 6 month and on to 12 month category, we will probably end up running some specific webinars and stuff for those guys to really try and keep them feeling warm and fluffy about the organisation. In terms of the people, as they do come in, I think there's probably 5 areas that are in my head that we will be focusing on, and this is very much work in progress, and Keisha and I even spoke yesterday on what help you guys can provide us. So it will be multi-stream. The first is, what's the existing corporate induction material? So a lot of that was online anyway, but clearly it talks quite a lot about things like checklists around, do you know where the toilets are, and is your workstation set up? So there's work to be done to make sure. I don't think we're going to have chance to reissue all the corporate induction material, but I think we will be looking at our line managers to make sure they're reinterpreting that for individuals as they deliver it, because they would be supporting that delivery. The second is around the business specific induction. This is always important, can be a bit patchy, but again, we're going to be upping the ante on our business to make sure that they're really, really clear around some of this stuff. So what's the job role and expectations, business information, the technical and professional and professional development areas. So we'll be putting in probably more support than we normally would from a corporate perspective to make sure the businesses are doing their bit properly. Then the other bit will be, we would always develop areas that would come in the standard induction, like diversity, inclusion, health and safety. And we'll do more, I think, on that in terms of webinar delivery to give them opportunity to network and have a chance to speak to individuals from those kind of areas. We'll obviously be talking to them about the content of their programs. And then in terms of soft skills, we're not quite sure how we will do this. This is the sort of stuff that we would have delivered in the 2-day face-to-face event. It would still be nice to have an event feel for something. And we have some ideas about how you might do that in this context. So, for example, the recruitment team have been showing me how they do online career fairs and some software that they use for that. So it might give the feel of coming into an event, and then they would come and hear some things in that. So work in progress, but growth mindset, resilience, very high on the agenda for us to deliver in that. And then the final area is really around network and community. So we've got a very strong, particularly strong graduate community. We also have probably an apprentice community that's developing, but the graduate community is very strong. Both of them have forums. And normally they would have been responsible for delivering things like welcome socials, either in business or in region for their local areas. So I have earlier this week spoken to those guys and challenged them around how that can work virtually. So we had some really interesting conversations. Myself and my director were quite keen on quizzes and stuff, but interestingly they were like, oh, we've been quizzed to death, we don't want to do that, which was quite an interesting reflection back to us, because we would have thought that was quite a good idea. So they've taken it away, but some of the things they were talking about was hosting themselves as forum members, acting as hosts for like mini groups of about 10 and breaking people down into smaller groups, having some kind of structure to it, but making sure that people felt like they had a smaller group they would get to know better. And then their ideas were that they might do that regionally and within business as well, to try and get those mixes up together. The other thing that we want to get them really involved in quickly is we've got, I don't know what everybody else is like on the call, but we have really, really active Yammer groups in the organisation. So they're on everything from diversity inclusion, LGBT plus, women's development, and then some kind of fun ones like burgers. Have you had a good burger recently, and where was it? Cats and kittens of the company, where people post pictures of their animals. So photography. So there's all sorts of existing quite strong virtual communities, and those are across the global organisation. So trying to get them pointed in the direction of those and making them feel like, yes, there's a bigger company out there that you can engage with and join is going to be quite important. So I think that's it in a nutshell.
Brilliant, Jo. Thank you so much. And lots of the things you're doing completely in line with the best practice onboarding stuff that we're going to come on and talk about. So well done.
Phew.
And the main thing I just wanted to say, and then I've got one question, and Keisha, please pipe up with anything either you have or that's in the chat. But one of the things that we will come on to talk about, because I know, Jo, you'll need to drop off, and thank you again for making the time for this morning, is the importance of trying to set the bar still quite high for onboarding virtually, and sort of trying to see it as, well, how do we still give them, the best experience, because it's still going to be their first day on the job. And so I love the fact that you're trying to think about how do they still get that event feeling, because we've been grappling with this when we're designing programs for clients. Do you just say, well, nobody wants to sit on a online all day, or do you actually go, well, no, hang on a minute, how do we reimagine what a day might look like? So it's not obviously Zoom meeting after Zoom meeting, which we all know can get tiresome, but how do you create something that might still make them feel like it was a really impactful kind of first day? So that's all sounds really fantastic, and thank you. Because it's the question we've asked the group, I just wondered what are you most concerned about? What if you're being kept awake at night, which I hope you're not, about this. What's the thing that you're kind of most worried about?
Well, as I think I said, I put it on the group chat, it's making them feel like they're welcome, because I think that's a real issue. And in fact, Keisha and I were talking on a call yesterday about the fact that what will be different from them, you know, they'll have been sitting in their bedrooms doing their schoolwork or not, and then what will be different from yesterday doing that to today being part of their first main job. You know, they're not going to be putting on their shiny shoes and new suit, and having that kind of having that milestone feeling that they would have done, and feeling like they're welcomed in, and that, you know, everyone's marking this big event in their lives. And that's the thing that's concerning me, is how we can get that across to them. So that's it.
Thank you, Jo. That's brilliant.
No worries.
I know you need to dash.
I do.
Thank you so much for making the time.
That's all right. Thanks, guys.
Speak soon. Thank you so much.
Speak soon. So it's been going off in the chat function.
Like
I think I will read some comments out. I will summarize them in, I think there are 3 big themes of connection, engagement, and culture. So making sure everybody feels engaged virtually, feeling connected to the organization, each other, but also the values and the culture of the business. People being concerned about, Tony here's put a great one, which is about, you know, losing out on networking or those informal learning opportunities that you get. Kate saying, you know, still trying to convey the culture, and how do we do that and build a community while we're virtual. Carol, you know, similar comment, how are we keeping them engaged for this prolonged period of time? You know, if an induction is going over several weeks or even into months. Lots about, you know, concerns, and we've heard this in previous sessions about, you know, how concerns from graduates or interns or apprentices about how they build their network, they build those connections. I'm just seeing if there are any more. Feeling part of the team. Alexandra, great, I think from EY's, great comment saying, you know, keeping a personal connection when trying to onboard 1,000 students. So yeah, lots of themes around, and they touch on what we're going to speak about, but yeah, connection and engagement, very high on the agenda for most people.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think that point around keeping them engaged for a prolonged period of time, I mean, I think irrespective of how long the onboarding or induction process is, there's, you know, how do you keep them feeling that, I suppose the opposite risk of having a brilliant onboarding is, you know, when it kind of peters off, how do we make sure that they're still feeling engaged and involved and supported? So what's the sort of what's the longer term plan as well? But yeah, I think that's incredibly challenging, the idea of from one day to the next they've suddenly started with a company, and how do we bring to life the culture of that company? So well, definitely some things that we'll address in a moment. And I know we've got Gemma, who I can even see. Morning, Gemma. Who's going to tell us a little bit more about what they are doing at Fidelity. So thank you so much for joining us, Gemma.
Sure, no problem. Apologies, the light kind of keeps dipping in and out, so I may be in the shadows for some.
I very much like the colour of the background. It's a very cool wall.
I'm stuck in the dining room, I'm afraid, the only quiet room in the house. Hi everybody on the call. I recognise some faces. Laura, hello, I haven't seen you in a long time. But it's great to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our internship program, I guess, kind of moving away from the grad program. We're still very much in the planning stages for that, and I think some of the things that we're going to be adapting and, you know, very much pivoting our model for the internship, it may be, you know, we may then take on some of that for the grad program, but we're going to kind of, it's a bit trial and error. Sorry, not being very articulate this morning. So if I think about, let me just give you a bit of background, I guess, a bit of context. So I'm Gemma Elson, Global Head of Early Careers at Fidelity. I've only been at Fidelity for 7 months, so I'm still very much getting my feet under the table, really understanding what our current landscape is in terms of all early careers intakes across the globe. but we take roughly, I would say, anywhere between 200 and 250, depending on the economic environment, year on year, and that's across all entry points, so apprentices, interns, industrial placements, and grads, as well as MBA interns and grads. I think when I look at the overall kind of comparators percentages, roughly speaking, we take around, our early careers talent is around 3% of our overall population, which I think is on the conservative side when I speak to people in the market. I think it's anywhere between sort of 3 and 5%. But we definitely want to maintain that junior talent pipeline. So this year we're taking on 59 interns from 12 different countries. The number of countries has jumped up considerably in this pandemic environment, given that people are now working from all over the place and not necessarily in the location in which they were hired. But it definitely makes for exciting times. And actually, I think it's stretched us actually when we're thinking about how we're going to make sure that we can keep all of these people connected and engaged across the various time zones. So if I think about how we've adapted the model, we are obviously going to be remotely delivering the internship in its entirety this year. The internship is 10 weeks. So in Asia, typically we would have a 12-week internship, and in the UK we would have 8 weeks. But what we've done is, again, in order to increase that feeling of connectivity, we're actually having one global start date. So the Asia internship is slightly reduced to 10 weeks, and the UK Europe internship is slightly increased to 10 weeks. Instead of having just 1 week of training as we normally would, a little bit of behavioural and a little bit of technical training, actually we're increasing that training to 2 weeks. So it should be very robust. We will have 1 week of technical training and 1 week of behavioural skills training, and a kind of general induction week where we have lots of overviews of the various business lines and welcomes from senior leaders. So I'm really excited to be working with DBL on that. And we have made sure that the training is specifically tailored to thinking about how to handle oneself in this remote environment. So looking at, remote self-management, remote personal branding, remote teamwork and collaboration, and using an adaptable mindset. And then and that's just the upfront training. We've got some continued learning throughout the program on kind of resilience and learner-see mindset as well. Interestingly, I feel when we look at one of the things that we've had to look at is what is the typical model. So in terms of learning and development, we talk about the 70-20-10, don't we? And there's a lot of reliance on managers, that's 70%. In these times, that's not as easy to do, particularly when they are under a lot of pressure to be delivering on their BAU remotely and have had to, adapt to new ways of working. So we are really leaning into that 20%, so the networking, leaning into the buddy program, leaning into the mentor program, and also coffee chats with senior leaders. So as much as possible, we are trying to create, I use this term again, but a really, really robust support network for them, because the one thing that does keep me awake at night is losing their engagement, and actually also recognizing that we're losing their engagement, because this is the other part of it. How would we know if we're losing them? So we've got very, very regular touch points planned with them throughout that 10-week period. And communication, I think, is just going to be absolutely key. So touching on something that Joe said, with regards to ramping up their Keep Warm campaign, we've done exactly the same for our interns. So we've been communicating with them now for the last month, sending regular communications. So at least one each week, but it's been I'm really proud of the team, to be honest. It's been almost like a newsletter, absolutely packed full of information about the company, about what to expect when they join, any issues with their technology, and how to really prepare themselves as much as possible for this. So I mean, we will see on Monday whether or not all of that has been worth it. I guess the other things that we're doing in terms of making sure that they feel included, and really, you know, to your point, Keisha, around the 3 common themes that have been coming up in the chat box around connection, engagement, and culture. We want to make this the most authentic experience that we possibly can for them. And as such, we've been trying to, I guess, deliver what we normally would if they were coming in person, but just remotely. So we actually sent them all gift packages as well, with, you know, the regular stash that they would get, so that they still feel like they're getting that experience. And you know, so it sounds silly, but they'll all have a Fidelity pen, they'll all have a Fidelity notepad, they'll all have their gym bags. So you know, fingers crossed that will also help to create a sense of immersing them in our culture. What else are we doing? So one of the things that we, as a team, when we were brainstorming, you know, we're thinking, okay, so what do they get when they come in and they're face to face and they're grabbing a coffee from the table, or they're sitting down next to each other during the classroom learning, or even just, you know, the welcome speeches. The one thing you do is you turn to the person sitting next to you and say, hi, how are you? Where, you know, what university do you come from, etc. So that's the one thing that you don't get on Zoom. So we're actually going to, in that very, very first session of the day, use breakouts and do speed dating, so to speak. So they'll get 5 minutes, you know, one-to-one with probably around 5 of their peers, just to kind of kickstart that process. So because of the numbers, we won't be able to do it obviously with everybody, but at least once they've started doing that, hopefully they will then continue, you know, in their own time and start building and forging those relationships, because of course that's one of the most important parts of their internship is, you know, the relationships that they come away with. We will be also sending out, you know, a lot of comms. So our CEO is going to be sending a welcome note, which will be personalised to each of the interns on day 1, which is fantastic. We're so lucky.
That's amazing.
We've got the senior leaders from each of the business areas doing the same. We've already published, prior to them joining on Monday, we've got our intranet has a kind of source page, you know, news, global news, but also local. So we've posted local articles with a headshot of each intern and a little bio taken from our profile book, so that the company can see who they are, a little bit about them, and then welcome them or know who they are when they join. So we'll have another article published bringing all of those local articles together on Monday, and that will be global. We're also going to be running, well, we're going to be using MS Teams an awful lot, and it was interesting to hear Joe saying they've got the Yammer Teams for you know, company cats and employee cats and dogs and things like that. We've got MS Teams for yoga, meditation. We have a massive push on wellness at the moment. So there's lots of activity going on in that space. And we'll be introducing our interns to our employee resource groups, which are F for E, Fidelity for Everyone. So there's lots of pockets of activity going on there. I know that Joe was saying people are quizzed out, but we are going to do a quiz. We have a resident quiz master who's an absolute hero and has a disco ball light that goes on in the back. He's doing it. So
that's next level.
So that should be good. And we also, you know, want to make sure that that we're providing them with opportunities to connect. So we're also going to be running a CSR project throughout the internship, where we will be asking them actually to fundraise for people that have been suffering during COVID-19.
That's lovely.
And we'll be using Just Giving for that. And they're actually amazing. There's various little sort of breakouts that you can have, so that you can have one big page, and it will make them feel like a community, and they'll have their individual teams, and those teams will be split across the regions as well, plus the business lines, so they're not going to be siloed in that regard. And then we'll make it competitive, so anybody who raises the most money will give them a little prize at the end. And again, we're trying to think slightly differently about prizes. You know, Blinkist, I don't know if you guys have that app, but it's got amazing playlists, and we were thinking about gifting them with an annual subscription to Blinkist.
Oh, wow.
So yeah, trying to get a little bit creative here, I guess, instead of, you know, throwing chocolates at them when they went through, something a little different. What else can I tell you about what we're doing? I think that pretty much kind of sums up, you know, I guess key themes that we've been thinking about. Yeah, and I guess, you know, does anyone have any questions?
Can I join? It sounds amazing.
I was about to say, Alice, please don't be offended if I say that I'd quite like to go now, and that's not anything on DBL.
I think I've made it sound far more exciting than what it may be in reality, but hey.
I'm wondering if you've had any sleep in the last 9 weeks, Gemma. That sounds not phenomenal amount of work.
It's definitely been pretty intensive, but, you know, fingers crossed it'll be worth it. And actually on Monday, I think another thing that keeps me awake at night is the technology. I'm a bit of a dinosaur when it comes to tech. I've even struggled with the chat box on Zoom, for example. Like, I'm not on the chat box because for some reason I don't have access. So we're running a Get Connected session with our tech hub on the first day, so that, you know, if people are struggling, they can dial in and there's somebody on hand to help them and talk them.
That's great.
So I also just think that that's going to be absolutely key. And actually our day 1 next week is day 0. So Monday is day 0, and it's a day just for getting your tech set up and getting connected to Fidelity. And then from day 2, so Tuesday to Friday, that's when we'll have the introductory sessions and training.
That's phenomenal, Gemma. And I just wanted to, well, firstly, thank you so much. And I really don't know how much sleep you must have been getting. But secondly, to the point around culture, I mean, I think one can already get a sense of the Fidelity culture just from what you've just described, you know. And for the interns, what, you know, to be receiving packs, to be getting messages from the CEO, the consideration of day 1 is actually day 0, which is also incredibly inclusive, because of course some of your interns will be very tech enabled, but you're not penalizing the ones that aren't. So, you know, you just, that's the thing, isn't it? It's like you're really bringing to life authentically what Fidelity is and what Fidelity stands for by literally immersing them in kind of a big warm hug, a big warm virtual hug of everything. And the fact that you sat down and brainstormed and thought about what, you know, what would the real experience have been like and how. That's exactly, you know, that's, if there's one main theme this morning, and it was why we deliberately chose to look at, well, let's start with what onboarding best practice is and then talk about how to virtualize it, not go, well, what's virtual onboarding? Because I think if you start from what's virtual onboarding best practice, you might start from, well, what can you do on Zoom? Whereas if you start from what you know, what were the objectives? Why do we do onboarding? What do they get from it? What's important? And then ask yourself, how do you bring that to life? You know, you're starting with the sky's the limit and how do we achieve it, rather than what can the tech allow us. And that's very much what I heard from everything that you said there. So, I mean, I think, you know, everything from the connection, the engagement, and really a strong sense of the Fidelity culture coming through there. I also really liked your point, and actually it's not something that I'll be honest, I've thought about enough, and relatedly that I've heard much about, which is, I've put measurement, but you know, you've talked about those touch points, like how do we actually make sure that this is working? And one of the things I think that's a real challenge for all of us is the salience of our interns and our grads. You know, in terms of, I think at the moment they're hugely in mind, and you know, whatever the size of our intakes, it's like, how are 250, 750, whatever, how are we going to make them feel supported, etc. And then when they're in, how do we keep remembering them? And especially for managers, you know, I know we're working and have had lots of conversations with Laura about, you know, the challenge, as we all do, of managers being engaged and how do they support early career talent anyway. And now it's even more difficult because they're not there. So how do we help to make sure that managers have got them front of mind, and you know, that responsibility is salient. And I think touch points is a really good way to kind of, you know, if people are aware that there are going to be regular check-ins and on how they're doing, then it makes it more, it's not so sort of thing that can just be swept under the carpet, not deliberately, but yeah, how do we make them more salient? So Gemma, thank you, phenomenal. Koecher, do we have any...
Yeah, so Ben from Capital One saying, sounds great, Gemma, because I know you can't see the chat function. Thank you for sharing. Just a clarification point, and you may have missed it if you don't know it, but the one of the resources Gemma mentioned at the end is Blinkist. Have a look. It like summarizes lots of books, has lots of these learning playlists. As Gemma says, it's a fantastic resource. And Gemma, what a great gift to give people. That's fab. There is a question from Andrew at RWE, who is the man who, for anyone who was joining at the beginning, we were praising the growing of his lockdown beard. He's laughing now. He says, really like the idea of sharing profiles in advance. How much does it rely on individual line managers to deliver this being the onboarding, not the profiles? That's the question to you, Gemma.
Yeah, I mean, let's just say it's still significant. There is still significant onus on the line manager, which is why actually DBL are helping us with increasing our kind of line manager training. And in fact, Katrina was delivering the first session this morning, which is great. So yeah, there is still significant reliance on the line managers to get this right, which is why we have been sending out I say regular comms. I mean, we've sent them a couple of emails packed full of information. Now, the issue is whether they read it or not. And we all know that they don't always open up their emails and read everything, especially when it comes to interns and grads. You get some amazing line managers that always will, and that will try their best and fully engage, but there's always going to be some that aren't. I guess all I can say is we're just, we're kind of trying our best, but yeah, I think the one thing that we're doing is, like I said, we are having regular touch points, and I mean that from an early careers team perspective with our interns. So we're splitting up the class so that we will also be responsible for a certain number of them. And I think it's on us actually to ask them the right questions. How are you finding the relation? How is your relationship with your line manager? How often are you touching base with them? We've suggested to the line managers that they touch base, at minimum once a week, but it would be nice if they could, through some form of technology, touch base with them every single day. I mean, I touch base with my team every day. I send them a Skype message in the morning, just say morning, partly to show them that I'm online and that I'm there. So I think we'll soon get a sense of who is, which line managers are providing a good amount of support and which aren't. And then through that, hopefully we can give those that aren't a bit of a prod to say, look, you may want to up the ante here a little bit and perhaps dial up your touch points with your intern.
Brilliant. And one of the things that we've talked about in sessions we've had before, specifically about manager support, and that's come through in research, is that is the empathy gap. So what a lot of organisations find that the managers who grew up in that organisation can be better, because they literally know what it was like to be a grad, and they sort of see in their grads themselves, and they understand, what it felt like and what support they needed. And so one of the things that can be really helpful is trying to reduce that empathy gap for those who aren't doing it. And I think it really is about, it's like you did, and what we're trying to do is think about what does it feel like having your first day in an organisation? What were we expecting when we joined companies, and how must these students be feeling in this context? And pretty much everybody sympathises with how hard it must be to have ended, in many cases, to have ended your education in such strange times and to be starting your first job. And because I think there could actually be the possibility of unlocking there in managers that empathy piece, which is like, gosh, this was always hard and now it's even harder, and understanding that they will quite rightly need, want and deserve more support and connection than before. So yeah, thanks, Gemma. Keisha, any other observations, reflections, questions, anything?
No, just a bit on there about other resources like Get Abstract, which I think is quite similar. So no, otherwise I think we're ready to move on to the science. Brilliant. Bit.
Well, Gemma, thank you very, very much. And apparently you've got probably loads more if we ask, but additional interns if you want them.
Yes.
And seriously, good luck for Monday, and indeed official day one, Tuesday. I really look forward to hearing how it all goes. And thank you, a phenomenal amount of work, very obviously. And I think your interns sound very lucky. Thank you. All right, so I think we've just, heard a load about onboarding best practice, and I think the good news for sort of Joe and Gemma is hopefully they'll just be able to sit there and go, oh yeah, we've ticked all those boxes, and can kind of sit back. So well done. But as anyone who knows me knows, what I like to do is look at the science, the data, the research. Whenever tackling a question, what does the best science, the best research show we should be doing in this situation? And as I said, I wanted to start from, not what's best practice in virtual onboarding. Let's be honest, no one's done it to this scale before, so there simply isn't that much data yet. But onboarding is actually one of the areas of organisational psychology that's received the most attention. And so there is a wealth of stuff out there. So we've synthesised from a number of meta-studies some of the top tips, and we're going to come onto those in a minute. But the first point I wanted to make was how important the onboarding of graduates are. So the first point is, and we say this very often when we talk about the challenge of transitioning from education to the world of work, is that research shows it is one of the biggest transitions we make in our life. And that's, as compared to anything like getting married, having children, getting divorced, death, births, etc., etc. So it's a massive change, and one of the other things is that research from the ISE has shown that our employers, one of our biggest concerns is how to manage students' expectations, and of course one of the challenges we've got now is how are we managing expectations in this madly changing, ever evolving world. And when we onboard our graduates, it's a very specific thing around onboarding early career talent, so they've got this particularly big change, but actually any entry into a new organisation is defined as a very special boundary. And Ashford 86, but still often referred to, talks about that there's a very specific, intense need for information. And so it is a period in our lives where we're entering a new organization, and there's just a vast array of things that we don't know. So it's just, I know we all know how important onboarding is. We've seen that lots of organizations still are investing in grads. Obviously we've heard from Fidelity still investing in interns. We have these people who are moving from the world of education into business, and they're coming into a brand new organization, and the need for information is huge. So there is absolutely a requirement for onboarding. Is this a poll, Keisha? I think this should be a poll. Is this a poll? No, it's not. Okay.
No.
I think the poll hasn't gone in, so I'm just going to move on, also in the interest of time, because I think we're nearly at 9:30, so I want to make sure that we've got some time to jump into the detail. So in terms of onboarding best practice, we're going to look at two elements. One is the company's role, and then research also says that students have a role, and we're going to think about how we tease out the best student behaviours in onboarding in a minute. But what we're going to think about first is 6 tips for best practice onboarding. So this is what we should be doing kind of irrespective of whether it's virtual or face-to-face. These are the 6 most important things based on meta-analyses, which should be referenced, but it isn't. So we'll send around the link if anyone's interested afterwards. It's by Burr and Eggerdam, who are very primary researchers in the area of what used to be called organisational socialisation, and apparently around 2010 became more commonly referred to as onboarding. So onboarding best practice, the first thing is, being really clear on your objectives, timelines, roles and responsibilities. So, absolutely, as with all planning, we ought to be starting out with what's the main reason that as an organisation we're onboarding. And, some of the things that have come through here is around connection, engagement and culture. If the number one thing is that our graduates come away, or our interns come away, with an understanding of what being a member of Fidelity or Atkins or RWE or HSBC is, then that needs to be a core objective. How are we making sure that they understand our culture? If a core objective is, how are we making sure that they're coming away with technical skills, be clear about that. If a core objective is how are we supporting them on behavioural skills, be clear about that. Absolutely, the first thing that we need to do is outline what we're trying to achieve, so that we know we can judge if we've been successful at the end, and we can set the right steps in place. And then the second thing is, relatedly, is obviously being really clear about timelines, roles and responsibilities. How long is it going? Who are we relying on? How much are we carrying? in our roles, how much are we delegating to managers, and being as clear and transparent with everybody who's involved as possible. So very, very basic, but absolutely critical and important not to forget in these strange times. Another really key thing is providing information before they start. So, you know, not we've heard about keep warm strategies, you know, it's especially at the moment, we'll talk about this more, but with the uncertainty, you know, they want to be communicated with before they start. It's not a kind of a day zero thing. How are we connecting with them? How are we helping them? And we always talk about this when we talk about pre-boarding, you know, how do we help reduce cognitive load? How do we help pre-load them with information? Because obviously from day one, they're going to be even more inundated. So, you know, and particularly we have an opportunity obviously at the moment when they're sitting at home potentially to capitalize on some more free time than they might normally have. Again, remembering that these are best practice onboarding principles, and we'll come on to think about how we virtualize those. It is really, really important to make the first day on the job feel special. You know, they're going to remember their first day for the rest of their lives. I'm pretty sure we all do to some extent. You know, and it will convey to them what the organization's culture is. It will convey to them how the organization feels about them starting, how the organization prioritizes their people. So, you know, how do we make sure that their first day feels special as one of 6 core onboarding best practice principles. So, and another one is making it really formalized, really clear, really transparent. So, you know, people like to know where they're going. That's why presentations always start with a roadmap. You know, how is their time going to be spent? What is their journey? Being really, really clear, obviously for ourselves and the organization, so that we can all galvanize behind it. But for the graduates, you know, or interns, what do the first weeks and months, years look like, so they understand the journey. And then a kind of 5th point, and again, you know, you can see why all of these are going to be very relevant when we think about virtual, but these are best practice onboarding principles. You know, do make sure that it's participatory or interactive, you know, and this is all kind of linked to the importance of, I think, we often share, and I did think there was a slide on self-determination theory, which underpins all of kind of DBL's best practice, that people have 3 core psychological needs, which are around feeling connected, feeling capable, and feeling in control or autonomous. And making things interactive enable all of that. So, you know, it gives them the opportunity to connect to other human beings, gives them the opportunity to feel capable because they're actually practicing things, and gives them the ability to feel autonomous and control because they're actually putting things into action and trying things out. So really, really important that onboarding is interactive. And then, yeah, a final point is engaging stakeholders. So, you know, how are we engaging stakeholders across the business, from managers to other peers, to obviously fantastic examples of, you know, what leaders, even in the case of Fidelity, getting the CEO involved, you know, how do we make them feel connected to the wider organization? And obviously, you know, if we look at these six things, to a certain extent, all of them hit along the 3 core things that were coming out as themes of concern around connection, engagement, and culture. You know, if you're clear on your objectives, you know, and one of them is around how to drive culture, that will come through. You know, how are we bringing the right people in to bring to life the culture and to engage with students? So those were 6 of the key things that any onboarding program necessarily needs to do from a best practice perspective. And particularly from the employer point of view. There are 3 things that research shows we want our students to bring to the fore when they are joining an organisation, and they all come under the umbrella term of newcomer proaction. So obviously we know that proactivity is preferable to inactivity, and I think there was you know, some discussion earlier on about how, you know, I think it was particularly around like networking. So I think it was Gemma saying, you know, you start off giving them the opportunity to network in breakout rooms, but then you're hoping that they're going to continue doing that. You know, newcomer proaction is always important, and obviously it's going to be even more important in this strange world that we're in. So the three themes of proaction that we want to see and draw out of our students are around sense making. So this is basically in all senses. You know, they are coming to an organization for the first time, they're coming to employment for the first time. We've just sort of seen that one of the biggest challenges around the, you know, amount of information, amount of knowledge gaining that they have to do, one of the best things that we can empower them to have is this proactive desire to make sense. And essentially that means that you know, anytime they're given some information, they are actively trying to make sense of that, and to link it to what does that mean for them, how, you know, technical skills, how's that going to be brought to life in their role, behavioral skills, how's that going to empower them to do better, you know, organize, you know, organograms, how does that fit into their world. They're literally a sponge gaining information, and what we want them to do is be proactive about making sense out of all the information that they're provided with. And we're going to come on to talk a little bit more about how we do that in a virtual sense in a moment. The second thing that we really want them to be proactive about, that research shows is incredibly important for them to be proactive about, is around relationship building. So obviously we know that networking is incredibly important, and we know that people who really thrive when they join an organisation are the ones that build connections, build relationships. And so the students that will do the best, one of the behaviours we really want to encourage, support and see is that they proactively look to relationship build. And again, we'll talk about how to improve that in a virtual context in a minute. And then the third and final newcomer proaction behaviour that we want is positive framing, which I love, and I was very glad to see in the research, because framing is one of my favourite behavioural skills. And Gemma talked a bit about this, but, you know, in supporting the Fidelity interns, we're helping them to have a positive adaptable mindset to positively frame things. You know, everything from the worst thing, and it will happen to some students, for a student to do in this context would be to stay in the woe is me, you know, I'm not, like, imagine their first day, they're feeling miserable because they're not in the office. That's not what we want. We, you know, and it Covey circles, focusing on what you can control versus you can't. None of us can control the fact that they won't be walking into offices on their first day. What we want them to be doing is positively framing every experience that they have from the organisation, and we'll talk a bit more about how to engender some of those behaviours in a moment. Koecher, is there anything from the chat box, or should we move straight on?
Let's go on.
Great. So those are 6 employer best practice strategies, and then 3 things that we want to elicit from students anyway in any context, so keep those for when we're all back face to face. And now we're going to think a bit about how that evolves in a virtual context. And I'm pausing and smiling because our fantastic marketing colleague has done some really whizzy stuff with these slides, which I was just hoping has worked. So in terms of being clear on objective timelines, roles and responsibilities, you know, how do you so obviously the additional question that we now need to be asking ourselves is, how will you tailor their experience to deliver against these virtually? And again, I think it was really clear, the story that Gemma told this morning, that that's exactly what they did. So what were the things that they were trying to achieve with onboarding with Fidelity's interns normally, and how do you achieve those in a virtual context? And you can see how that journey, that chain leads to the right outcome. So, you know, what do we want them to gain? We want them to gain connections. How do they get that in a real context? Well, they meet up in small groups. Well, how do we create that in a virtual context? Well, there are breakout rooms, you know, and I think that brilliant to be doing that early on in day one. And then the kind of build on that is, how do we keep that going? You know, how do we, so linking that into the kind of student proactivity, what can we do to ensure that they're actually taking that experience, that necessary relationship building element, you know, which would be a core part of any of our objectives for an onboarding program, and proactively creating those moments for themselves. And so that might be in channels, you know, MS Teams in the case of Fidelity. What are the platforms that we're giving them to do that, and how might we encourage it? You know, do we have managers who are arranging, you know, taking the lead on creating little breakout groups? Do we do it around themes such as wellness, yoga, cats and dogs, etc.? You know, how do we make it easier for them to be proactive, to make sure those things happen? And then I really like the point about checking in. You know, how are we, the point around culture, so thinking about, so, you know, connection, engagement, culture, thinking about culture, how are we conveying the culture? You know, I think imagining our students sitting at home, as we've said, in the same rooms that they were studying, you know, weeks before, how much of an impact will it make if they've got Fidelity stash, you know, if they're writing their first notes with a branded pen, you know, and clearly that conveys a kind of cultural thing that Fidelity goes above and beyond, and I know lots of the organizations that we've got here today are doing the same. So the first thing is, you know, start with being clear about objectives, timelines, roles and responsibilities, and then thinking about how you deliver to those in a virtual context. You know, and we've also heard people talking about, you know, does it change things like the timelines? Are they longer or shorter? Does it change the roles and responsibilities? You know, do we need to rely on more people, different people? So the first thing to do is be clear on objective, timelines, roles and responsibilities, and then think about how to virtualize each of those. The second point is providing information before they start, and you know, that's always been important, as I said earlier, you know, thinking about cognitive load, and our recommendation around here is, you know, what can you pre-board, what can you preload? You know, in this virtual context, the whole thing around the uncertainty that we know students are feeling, there is more appetite for this. I know we've spoken to some organisations who've said that typically, you know, the founders of the organisation or the leaders of the organisation have been reticent to load too much stuff onto graduates before they join, because it's their last summer and they should be having a big hurrah. Well, unfortunately, nobody's having the same kind of big hurrah that they normally might, or, you know, that we might hope they would. There is much more need from the student side, and you know, relevance from our side, to pre-board and preload them. So, you know, in some cases we're hosting webinars before people actually start, and in, you know, other cases, certainly, you know, what can we be sending them so they can be getting more and more comfortable with the organisation, and that will help reduce their uncertainty. And I know for lots of you that's already part of kind of keep warm strategies, and one of the things that you know, one of the themes that's very, very important is around enhancing belonging through doing all of this. And we know that different groups feel differently cautious and nervous about joining organisations. So a really important thing we can do to support inclusion and to support more diverse groups is to sort of, you know, pre-board, keep warm, communicate, make them feel like they belong before joining. Because for those who are more anxious, which are often more diverse groups, research shows that's even more important. Make the first day on the job feel special. So, and this is kind of a theme that I've been talking about, but like, really don't underestimate what you can do remotely, because it's still going to be their first day. So I think we're like the guardians of making sure that they still feel amazing about joining their organisation, and our objective almost ought to be like, how do we make them go, wow, I literally had no idea, you know, virtually joining an organisation could feel so impactful, so amazing. You know, what is it that we do on that day or those days that makes them so different from another day? And so, you know, and you know, all of us, and please, if anyone has any ideas or been doing anything specifically, and Koecher will come on to talk about some examples in a minute, share. But you know, we've moved from thinking, oh well, best practice, you can't have too many Zoom webinars or sessions in a day, to actually, no, it's their day. How do we create a structured day that might have events, and then go away and doing activities and coming back together? And, you know, and there are, it's interesting about quizzes, because I think they have been done a lot, but obviously a quiz with a glitter ball might be slightly different. You know, how do we make those things really amazing? And there's some really phenomenal virtual experiences. So I've mentioned them before, but we have things like virtual escape rooms and stuff like that. And just remembering that, you know, we are coming out of lockdown a bit, but we're still not in the context where we're competing with people going to clubs and things like that. So yep, I'm going to speed up, Keisha. I know that look. Formalising the orientation programme, so and providing a written overview. So in the virtual context, what does that mean? Here comes the reveal. Yeah, the sky's the limit. So, you know, making sure that, again, we set our objectives broad and high, and don't imagine that we are restricted and limited by the virtual context. And making it participatory and interactive. You know, let's optimize the fact that it's easier to make better connections in some contexts. I don't know whether Fidelity's CEO would have spoken to all the interns under normal circumstances. Great if he would, but how fantastic that we can record a video and get that. And we've talked about this before as well. Like, you know, if they're seeing their CEOs probably sitting in his study, you know, at home, like we're actually, and we're all seeing each other in our own homes. Like there is a level of human connection that this strange situation has brought about, which kind of in some ways is not as good, but in other ways kind of goes deeper. And also there's a real desire for that connection. So we may find those breakout groups with that we create for graduates create really long lasting connections because they are more precious, because they are rarer. And engaging stakeholders. So in a virtual context, what will you do differently due to virtual settings? And that's everything from, you know, can we use videos to get busy leaders involved, through to, you know, how do we make sure that this is easier for managers? And one of the things we always say is, you know, support managers by giving them tips on how to, you know, sometimes they don't support their grads because they don't know how to. They might need support on how to have conversations, how to engage. The session that Gemma referenced that's running this morning is about how to energize and support interns remotely. So literally giving them ideas about how to do it so it's easier will be really, really important. So Koecher, I think you're going to speak to each of those briefly and possibly bring in Ben.
Yeah, I think you'd probably all rather hear from Ben than me, but just very quickly, two things I was going to reference, which I've just put in the chat box. So one, Alice found a great case study of police now. It's in the HR Grapevine magazine, and basically all the things that they do. So they basically had to very quickly onboard 600 people, graduates, into something like 17 different forces, and they had like a month to sort it out. So I've just put the link to that in the chat. We also, and Ben, massive nod to you and to Laura and to Gemma actually, we wrote a kind of top 10 tips for building connectedness virtually. I've also just shared that. Now I do have a little case study for each of these, but actually Ben, if I am allowed to bring you in a second, when I spoke to Ben weeks and weeks ago about what he was thinking about his interns, a bit like Joe shared, he had an amazing kind of 5 pillars. And I think what we've heard from Joe and Gemma, and what I definitely saw when I spoke to Ben, is that I think the employers who are getting this right really are putting themselves in the shoes of those early career talent and really thinking holistically about it. And I think very lucky for them that they have employers that are doing that. So Ben, if I can see you're there, I'm going to ask to unmute you. You should be able to unmute yourself. And I'm going to ask you to share, because you've kind of have basically ticked all of these boxes.
Thank you, Keisha. Yeah, I'll try and to, I guess, whiz through this in 5 minutes. But there's a lot of overlap actually with what Gemma's already said. So I guess what might be more useful is if I talk through kind of the 5 pillars, and then how we've kind of got to the level of detail beneath them. So really, when we started to think about how do we virtualize our internship, I kind of split it all out into 5 pillars. The first one being strengthen the support network. And I was really clear then that, you know, without the support from mentors, buddies and managers and the teams, and then also the program team, that this is just not going to work at all. So we've done quite a bit of thinking around how do we set really clear expectations with managers, mentors, buddies. How do we also have really good relationships with existing graduates and previous interns so that they've got another support mechanism. And then, you know, each of those support roles, how do they kind of identify, you know, if there's any issues with the interns, and then that they're really clear kind of where to feed that back to. We've also been really clear with senior leaders around the capacity required to deliver this. So really pushing this down from the top that, you know, line managers, mentors, etc., they're going to need to dedicate some real time to this, and it's, you know, it's not good enough really just to you know, leave the intern alone, certainly for the first sort of 3 or 4 weeks. So we've really pushed hard at senior level to get 100% commitment on this. The second pillar is around remote delivery. So again, this is kind of been touched on quite a bit, but using things like breakout rooms in Zoom. We've been thinking about how can we use remote fun. So we've got a remote murder mystery on week one. We've got like a remote games night. So tons of different like remote activities, as well as kind of obviously the learning development and the delivery of the day job. And then also in this pillar, we've introduced kind of a new grad hub, we call it, which is just a site that helps to signpost them to everything that's relevant to them, really. So just to make navigating the organisation really simple, and kind of, I guess, help them to kind of cut through some of the noise that's on our standard Infonet pages. The third pillar is around expectations, and this is with interns and managers. And you know, we've really been clear that actually, when we're considering at the end of the program, who do we make offers to come back on the graduate program, that there is a chance we might need to reconsider kind of the bar that we usually set, because the reality is it's probably going to take these people a little bit longer to get up to speed, and therefore, you know, they might not deliver quite as much as you know, last year's interns. So again, just being really clear about how do we set expectations with everybody involved in this program. The fourth pillar is around sense of cohort. So similar to, I think, some of the other speakers earlier, Gemma and Joe, we're using a Harry Potter type house system, and we're kind of running games throughout with awards and competitions and things all the way through. We've also used our existing graduate community to really do a lot of the thinking around this, because you know, what I think might be quite cool, the interns might not. But also we've given them a lot of responsibility in terms of thinking, how do they create that sense of cohort? You know, how do they create a community of peer learning? So I've kind of, yeah, I guess, delegated a lot of the responsibility of that to our graduate community, and they've done some fantastic ideation around that. And then the fifth pillar is comms and keep warm. So similar to Gemma, we've already had virtual calls with our kind of chief marketing officer. We've sent out profiles of managers, mentors, buddies, and likewise we've taken profiles from the interns and shared them with the support network as well, purely in the interest really of helping them to hit the ground running much more quickly, and just feel a little bit more comfortable, I guess, on day one. So they're the 5 pillars. So strengthen the support network, remote delivery, expectations, sense of cohorts, and comms and keep warm. And then I guess in terms of how we've actually delivered all of this and kind of come up with the thinking beneath those 5 pillars. As I said, I have sort of a working group which consists of people who've been previously been interns, some of the more senior managers, but also a lot of our current graduates as well. So they've been doing a ton of thinking. And we're still thinking even now. So yesterday we had a 2 hours of purposeful doom and gloom, and we did a pre-mortem.
Oh, that's my favourite behaviour.
So just thinking about,
brilliant,
you know, everything that could possibly go wrong, whether that's, you know, that one of them sadly gets COVID and you know, is off for 4 or 5 weeks, or whether it's something simple like the tech doesn't work. So really just kind of, you know, thrashing out all of those ideas and then thinking about the ones that are really going to be impactful to do some extra work on. So I guess that's my 5 minutes, and I know that was really whistle stop, but I'm more
brilliant, Ben. Thank you. My apologies for not leaving you more time. No, you did that fabulously. Thank you.
Yeah, and I guess Gemma, you touched on it and talked about how we're working together. Ditto, Ben. But I also want to give a big shout out to Laura from HSBC, who's on the call. I think we have talked about it, but I guess just another point that you know, we've talked about pre-boarding and we've talked about stakeholders, but I think the role of managers, you know, it's a theme we've heard across, but it's becoming even more important, and how organizations are helping them to be perhaps a little bit more prescriptive than they normally would be. You know, again, I think what's come through from all the client stories is how much thought has gone into all of this, and you know, Alice has talked about the empathy gap, and So yeah, just wanted to add that's another big theme I think that we have seen, and I think employers like the ones I just mentioned are really leading the way on supporting those managers and recognizing that they themselves have obviously got lots on and are juggling many things. So a few people just sharing, saying this is really helpful, a few people needing to get off as we are nearly at time. Alice, is there anything else you really wanted to kind of
there are literally, there's literally 2 more slides. So just very quickly on the sense making thing, on the proaction thing, the main thing on sense making is making sure that you're integrating some kind of self-directed learning. So there's 2 ways to think about doing that. It's across the length of the program, but also when we have started to think about how to create impactful first days, events, and then, like I said, maybe getting them to go away and do a task and come back, like get them into that habit of actually, okay, I've been given a skill, or I've learned something, and now I need to go away and make sense of it. Is really important. So the more dynamic your program can be, obviously we've talked about 7-20-10, the better. What we're wanting to do is train them to be really proactive in trying to make sense of all the information that we're giving them. The proactivity on relationship building, how we empowering them to carry that on beyond breakout rooms and things that we might set up. And I think particularly thinking about managers, like actually it's a dynamic relationship, and we want the managers to be proactive, but we can encourage and empower our graduates to be proactive too. We can literally explicitly say to them, you can Skype them. And of course we all know that we have some in our own teams, we have people who are really proactive and will pester us if we go a bit quiet. That's what we want our graduates to be. They can be, as well as us pushing the managers, we could have the grads doing a bit of pulling. So empower and encourage our grads to be the ones that are really proactive in pushing the relationship building. And on the positive framing, thinking, we've talked a bit less today than we often do about the what in terms of content. We saw at the beginning they want more support around things like resilience and so on. A lot of the training around resilience and adaptability is around reframing, is around positive mindset. That we should in all that we do, good thing it's the end, I've clearly run out. All that we do, we should be helping them to frame positively, and there are explicit skills, tips and tools to help them do that, which would encourage. So in summary, onboarding is crucial for businesses and especially for early career talent, which we saw from research. The rules of the games haven't changed. Be clear on best practice, onboarding principles, and then strive for the best. Virtual is not an excuse for vacuous. So we all want to look back and feel that we delivered best in class, not kind of just navigated through this. And think about driving newcomer proaction. More than ever, the more that we can empower, enable and support our student talent to be proactive, the better this will be. We want them sitting in their rooms feeling hungry and pestering us and our managers, not feeling disempowered. So that's it. Thank you so much. We have just about kept to time. Koecher and I will stay on, so if anyone does have any questions that they would like us to answer, please pop them in the chat room. If not, thank you so much for joining. I hope you and your families are all super well and safe, and a huge big thank you to Joe, Gemma and Ben for sharing the fabulous things that you're doing, and we look forward to hearing from anyone else. If there's things that you would like us to share with the group, we can always follow up. So thank you very much, and lovely to see so many faces.
Really lovely. Thank you everyone. Some very nice comments coming through in the chat function. Thanks Susie, thanks Ben.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks Jill, thanks Victoria, Sarah Hart, nice to have seen you again. There's some lovely lots of
thanks Ben.
Thank you for stepping in at such short notice. That's great. Thanks.
That's all right, thanks.
Lots of lovely comments coming through, Alice, lots of compliments. Jill saying 2 months into my EC journey and this has been the best session I've attended. So many takeaways. Wow. Thank you, which is lovely. Susie saying thanks. Loads of people saying thanks.
Good. Oh.
So we will stay on for a minute. We've only got a couple of people left, and we're also just capture this. Okay, and I think we're down to just you and me.
Great.
Well done.
Thank you. Sorry, I did suddenly realise I was like, oh, I need to speed up. About the minute I saw your face.
That's cool.
Good, really good. Well done with getting Joe. All of them were brilliant,
weren't they?
Really, really good.
Gemma works so hard, doesn't she?
If I stop recording now, that's fine, isn't it? We don't need to,
yes.
We won't lose anything.
No, I'm just copying the chat function.
Stop recording.